Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Joining me today from the studio. It was great to meet you for the first time this afternoon. I was very excited to do that. How have you been?
Yeah, I've just been down south with my parents over Easter because we don't really have time to see each other over the weekend, and happened to be passing through the studio, so it made sense to come and do it from Novara Towers rather than from my purple bedroom.
Perfect. People complain about the lighting in that room, but you do have these wonderful posters behind you, But obviously your streaming setup also pretty fabulous. Coming up tonight, the Board of Deputies, or at least some members of the Board of Deputies, have signed a letter criticising the actions of Israel, obviously out of step with what we've usually heard from that organisation up to now. We've got an interview with economist Keyu Jin on China. I mean, having already won the trade war with Trump, I think, really interesting. Economist, Chinese national at LSE. She thinks that essentially the West just completely misunderstands China, and that is really hampering our ability to deal sensibly with relations with that country. Finally, we're looking at a beef between wealthy women when it comes to whether or not going into space paid for by Jeff Bezos is a valuable thing to do. Stay tuned for all of that. Before we get going, just another reminder, we're currently hiring. We're looking for an additional live stream producer to join our team and help us expand the production of this show. The ideal candidate would have demonstrable experience in live broadcasting environments, as well as strong knowledge of left-wing politics and current affairs. To find out more, go to the link in the description. As ever, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag Novara Live. And if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. The question of whether the Equality Act grants trans women the same protections as cisgender women has been winding its way through the British legal system for years now. Today, it came to an end as the country's highest court issued its decision. Deputy President of the Supreme Court, Lord Hodge, announced the ruling this morning.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not.
Now, the history of this case is a little bit complicated. On the one side was the Scottish Government. In 2018, MSPs tried to pass a law enforcing gender balance on public sector boards by applying quotas for women members. Now, in the original legislation, Holyrood said that the quota could include people who were living as a woman and who either had gone through or planned to go through the gender recognition process. But campaign group For Women Scotland argued that interpreting woman in that way undermined the rights of women as laid out in the UK government's 2010 Equalities Act. Now, in 2022, For Women Scotland took the Scottish government to court and won, with judges ruling that the categories of biological women and trans women were distinct under the Equalities Act. In response, the Scottish government tightened up the law, now saying that trans women only with a gender recognition certificate should be legally recognised as women for the purpose of these quotas. Then For Women Scotland took them back to court. In December 2022, the group lost, with another Scottish court ruling in favour of the government. Now, according to that ruling, trans women with a gender recognition certificate were women under the terms of the Equality Act. And it's that decision that's been overturned today. And the Supreme Court was clear that it saw its job as resolving a legal tension between two big pieces of Westminster legislation. On the one hand, you've got the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which allows trans men and women to have their chosen gender identity legally recognised. On the other, you've got the Equality Act 2010, which uses the word woman in a way that has been interpreted by one side as meaning just women who were born female, and by the other side as including women with gender recognition certificates. The law might have been clarified today, but that doesn't mean its implications are clear. And the BBC seems to think it could have limited impact, really. So this is sort of their explainer of what the impacts of this ruling could be. So they say the application of the law on the ground in real life was clearly foremost in the minds of the judges. Take the example of single-sex spaces and services, part of the motivation for Women Scotland bringing this case. The previous reading of the law was that everything from hospital wards and prison wings to support groups for victims of abuse can exclude everyone but women, thanks to exceptions in the Equality Act 2010. The concern from campaigners was that if people could change their sex with a certificate and then claim protection against discrimination as women, that could be more complicated. So I think they mean sort of cisgender women here, which is sort of the Equality Act had those carve-outs. And then they say that's particularly the case on a practical level, given those providing these services aren't actually meant to ask to see a gender recognition certificate. They go on. Now the court is clear that this exemption can continue. The rules underpinning women-only spaces can exclude people with gender recognition certificates. There are still conditions which need to be satisfied. Services will have to show that excluding trans people is a limited and proportionate means to achieving a legitimate aim. Blanket bans are discouraged. There is still a bar to clear. So they seem to be suggesting all this means is that a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate can't claim to have been discriminated against as a woman if they are excluded from a women's only space, if that organisation can justify it by some other means. So from this BBC analysis, it doesn't seem like much practically has changed. Other people's analyses differ. The campaign that brought the case especially seem to be viewing the ruling as a massive victory. Outside the Supreme Court in London, supporters of For Women Scotland, and that's a group that brought the case, were jubilant, singing victory songs while drinking champagne. Trina Budge of that group told Sky News how she understood the ruling.
The judge says this is not a victory for either side and it needs to be sober. What's your take on this?
Oh, it's absolutely a victory for women's rights. This case was always about women, never about trans rights, who, as Judge Hodge said, that they are fully protected in law still. But now we have clarity over what a woman means in law.
And this has been a long road to here, hasn't it? What does this change as of today? Because there's lots of legal talk, there's lots of discussion around what actually changes here as a result of this. In your view, what does that mean?
It means there's absolute clarity in law regarding what a woman is. We know for sure now that we are referring to the biological sex class of women, and that when we see a women-only space, it means exactly that. Just women, no men, not even if they have a gender recognition certificate.
So that's a quite expansive reading of this ruling. So suggesting that this now means that any women's space is only for people who were born biologically female. As I say, other analysis doesn't necessarily concur with that. And campaigners for trans rights have been understandably very troubled by the decision. This was Che Brown of rights group Trans Actual.
On a personal level, I woke up this morning as a transgender man, so someone that was given the label female at birth, but I know myself to be a man. I've got legal recognition. Legally, I'm male, and now this case, even for someone like me that does this sort of looking into our rights and protections for a job, I'm lost questioning what are my rights and protections. When I nip to the loo tonight on the way home at Euston, if I go in the men's, is someone going to tap me on the shoulder and tell me, you're not allowed to be in here, you're trans, you should be in the women's toilets? We're really unclear. And quite frankly, trans people are terrified. I've seen, lots in group chats that I'm in, people talking about this is the time to leave the country. Most trans people that I know already have in the back-up mind where it is they will move to. And given a lot of the language that was used to argue the appeal and previous appeals, a lot of the language is very Trumpian in terms of talking about even down to whether someone produces eggs or sperm. Is that what we're boiling ourselves down to as people? Our capacity or not to reproduce. And all of this, and yet in the judgment itself, I'm left wondering still what is meant by biological sex. Is it meant my chromosomes? I couldn't tell you what my chromosomes are, whether it's XX or whether it's something else. Is it my hormone levels? Hormonally, my testosterone's in the male range. Is it my genitals? Without going into too much information, you wouldn't class me as having female genitals. What is it? or is it the legal recognition that I've had for a few years, and that the law for our recognition has been in place for 25 years, the Equality Act has been in place for 15 years, and then suddenly, despite there not being any specific incidents that people are pointing to in relation to this case, trans people are suddenly thinking, hang on a minute, have I had some rights taken away from me?
It's a really interesting contribution. And I do think this idea that there's, because so much of the debate, I suppose because the debate was about self-ID for such a long time, was about people saying it's about biology versus identity. But obviously, biological sex is, you can change many of your secondary sex features, right? So how much testosterone or how much estrogen you have in you, that is biological. And trans people will have the hormones of the gender they identify with. So it doesn't seem as simple to me as some people suggest when they say biological sex versus the gender you identify as. The debate about the meaning of the ruling has, of course, made its way to Twitter. Former Labour MP Harriet Harman was involved in the drafting of the Equality Act. That's what was under discussion here. She posted this response to the Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court ruling correctly interprets the Equality Act, giving effect to our intention when drafting it. Single-sex spaces for women are important and can exclude trans women, but only where necessary. The Act and ruling protects rights of women while also respecting the rights of trans women. So she seems to be suggesting this doesn't really change much. It's still the case that automatically women's spaces should include cis and trans women, unless there's a sort of specific reason why trans women shouldn't be included. Guardian journalist Sonia Soda disagreed with Harman's interpretation, saying this isn't quite correct. As a matter of law, service providers need to justify a space or service being female only. They don't need to justify the exclusion of anyone male from a female-only space. On top of that, if you can't justify it being female only, it's mixed sex. Sonia Soda is a gender-critical journalist. I think she writes a lot about this. Someone who is siding with Soda's reading of this judgment is Dragon's Den star and gym chain owner Duncan Bannatyne. He tweeted this: "I hope all gym owners will join me now in agreeing that single-sex spaces for women means biological women. No gym should ever allow men into women's changing rooms." Helena, I suppose let's begin with sort of the legal implications, because I've read the sort of analysis from the BBC, from the Times, from the Guardian, sort of what this means, and I feel a little bit none the wiser. It seems like no one really does know what the practical implications of this ruling by the Supreme Court are going to be. I mean, what's your interpretation?
Well, it's in a bit of a limbo case at the moment, as far as I can see, because obviously there is this problem that you have reconciling this judgment with the provisions laid out in the Gender Recognition Act, which say under, I think it's Article 9.1, that anyone who has a gender recognition certificate legally, they acquired gender, and that also translates to sex as well, right? So once you have a GRC, in legal terms, you get treated as a woman or a man based on what you've transitioned to, not what you've transitioned from. So that's what a lot of this judgment is trying to tease out. And yet so much of the rhetoric and the discussion around it, as far as I can see, only makes this more confusing. Now, from what I understand too, I think the Harriet Harman in what we've just seen there is still correct in this case. The Equality Act is very, very clear in saying that you have to give special dispensation, essentially. You have to be able to argue your case to be able to restrict trans women from women's spaces, which was the case already. This was the case before any of the rulings today. If you were a female-only space, you could exclude trans women from being in that space as long as you gave a good reason for doing so. That hasn't changed as far as I can see from how this legislation has been brought about. The problem I have with the way in which this judgment's been ruled, there was a case that was brought to the European Convention of Human Rights in Strasbourg, or the European Court of Human Rights, ruling upon the ECHR in Strasbourg, which was Goodwin versus the UK, that showed that the UK government had breached the rights of a trans person, as a trans woman in this case, by not being able to adequately give her the legal recognition as a woman. And I believe that she had a GRC as well. So this kind of goes against that ruling there too. They even mention it in the actual ruling itself that was given by the Supreme Court. They mention a specific case, yet don't, for as far as I can see, give any reason as to why they've been able to get around it either. So there's a lot of unclear designations that's been given here. What's also unclear is what they even mean by biological sex. In the ruling itself, they say, oh, biological sex is self-evident. And as you saw from that campaigner that we played the video of from the news earlier, well, he was pointing out quite rightly that, well, unless you can give us a definition of what this is, then it's going to be difficult not just to categorize trans people in terms of the legislation, but intersex people as well, whether you choose the gametes people produce, whether you look at chromosomes, whether you look at genitalia, phenotype, genotype, all of these different kind of cluster properties that go into the way in which we define sex. These are all things that they haven't declared what one they're going to choose. They've just said, oh, well, it's self-evident. Well, is it really? I mean, the EHRC rather, the Equality and Human Rights Commission could not give a satisfactory definition of what a woman or a man was, of what in terms of biological sex, to the United Nations when trying to give their own justification for the exclusion of trans women. Interesting again, as always, that we talk about trans women here, and trans men just kind of get left out of the conversation so often. But given that the EHRC can't give that definition in a complete term, I'm not surprised that the UK Supreme Court haven't either, and just gone with it's common sense essentially, which is that's not an argument. That's not a reasoned argument. That is just the argumentum ad populum essentially. Well, everyone believes this, so it must be true. Which obviously, it's far more complex than that when we come down to the actual granular detail of what sex is and how we even perceive of sex within society. It's also difficult to understand how, if it is true that what Sonia Sodia believes is correct, and that in most cases trans people will be excluded from single-sex spaces based upon what they've transitioned to, how is this enforceable? It still seems incredibly difficult to enforce. Again, because not only are you going to have to, again, essentially be able to clock people, and then this will be weaponized, right? This will be weaponized against non-conforming people of any gender, whether they're cisgender or transgender, to make themselves justify why they should be in a space in the first place in reality. And then on top of this, well, what's stopping a cisgender man? Because again, they want to exclude men from women's spaces for their own protection, right? This is why the spaces exist kind of prima facie in the first place. Well, what's stopping a cisgender man from saying, well, I'm a trans man, you've told me I have to be in this space now. What you can do, you're going to inspect my genitals, you're going to do a birth certificate to use the loo. This seems very unworkable, which is why I think the Harriet Harman's interpretation of this is correct in the first place. Making it so that we all understand that trans people have access to these spaces, but there should be provisions for people to be able to make the case that they should be able to exclude them. So whilst I'm not happy with this ruling, I think that on both sides there's been a lot of either celebration or catastrophizing over something that seems the kind of best nuanced and at worst kind of incoherent. So I'm none the wiser until I see someone more expert with more legal expertise trying to untie this for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking all day. It's been surprising sort of how few, even on sort of like Sky News and BBC, they've got lots of advocates for both sides. You've got sort of people who sort of campaign on trans rights issues, sort of often talking about their personal experience. And then you've got people who from the for women's side. But someone to just sort of say, this is what this will actually mean has been a bit absent. I think maybe because no one knows at this point. It is an 88-page sort of ruling, isn't it? So going to take people a while to sort of look through it all and work out what this sort of fundamentally means. I think also the EHRC, Equality and Human Rights Commission, are going to be putting out some sort of advice to sort of those organizations for whom this might be relevant. It's interesting as well here, isn't it? Because this is, the Supreme Court, everyone keeps saying they've come down with this judgment unanimously, sort of suggesting there was no question here. It's obvious. Of course, this is sort of correct. But so I think in 2022, wasn't it, that this was by a different judge sort of thrown out of court and they sided with the Scottish government. So it is clearly the case that human judgment comes in here in terms of how this is interpreted. It doesn't seem like it is a legal open and shut case. I suppose the discourse sort of in the public sphere, the public realm, has changed quite a lot since 2022 to 2025. And you could say that this is an example of how I suppose cultural trends influence how, supposedly objective legal jurists come to their conclusions, which can obviously work in both ways, right?
Well, exactly, yeah. I think that the fact that it has had so much kind of court tennis being played with this specific ruling just shows you how open to interpretation, personal bias that it is. What I think is unsettling. I'm not going to try and decry these people who being activist judges or whatever. I think a lot of discussion around that with other rulings has been very frustrating and not particularly based in reality. But what I think is interesting in this specific case with regards to the personal biases of the people in question is that when they were choosing people to present arguments in this case, but I think it was Sex Matters, the Lesbian Project, and LGBT Alliance, or was it a Forum in Scotland as well, who were all asked to give some level of evidence to this hearing, if I remember correctly. And yet the only person, or the only group that was seen to provide any evidence that was at the least taking the side of trans people in this discussion was Amnesty International. They're just kind of a broad human rights group, you know? They aren't exactly specifically pro-trans or to take the trans person side in this argument. They're just a general broad human rights group. When they're asking for people to give evidence in this case on the gender critical side, you have not just kind of broad human rights organizations, but like explicit gender critical like pressure groups, people who are there, as far as I can see, to agitate with as much kind of lawfare as they possibly can to try and reduce the rights of trans people. That's my opinion of the way in which they conduct themselves, right? And so the fact that I think this was so one-sided in terms of who was asked to give evidence, I think that shows you at least some degree to which why this judgment has been made in the way that it is. In fact, in the actual ruling itself, they mentioned Ben Cooper Casey, who was believed was representing for those Sex Matters, who was included, it was mentioned in this ruling as saying, well, thank you to this specific Casey for pointing out that we really need to understand what biological sex means, what man and woman means. This is why we've come down in this judgment. Except, of course, having been asked and admitting that they should be trying to give a definition of what biological sex means, when actually pressed on what that means, they say, "Oh, well, it's common sense, isn't it? This is self-evident about what this means." So I'm like, well, no, you've not provided this. So it seems, again, as I said, very, very unsure. But I think that it is unsettling and frustrating to me that no pro-trans groups were even asked to give evidence in this case. And in fact, a transgender lawyer was asked to give evidence, and she was rejected for this. So this is again unsettling to me.
And I suppose so our Supreme Court is quite different from the American Supreme Court, because the American Supreme Court, they've got this constitution which is written in stone, and when the Supreme Court says something, the president and Congress can't just override it, right? Because they have a division of power. In this country,
I guess unless you're deporting people to El Salvador, apparently.
Exactly. I mean, maybe we can make some exceptions now that Donald Trump's president. But in theory, you've got this separation of power, which means that the Supreme Court does actually have sort of authority which can't be overridden, and unless you've got you can change the constitution with a 2/3 majority or whatever. In this country, if the Supreme Court says something the government doesn't like, they can just pass legislation the following day to say, okay, yeah, fair enough, that's how you interpreted statute as it's currently in law, but we can just make some new laws or change the laws. So in theory, the Labour government could say, okay, you've come to that decision, maybe the Equalities Act was ambiguous, but we want to give our version of clarity, which is a law which makes it clear that changing rooms should be trans inclusive. I'm just saying this sort of as an example. I imagine we're not in a political environment where the Labour government is going to be inclined to do that. I suppose, what do you think about sort of that? Well, maybe this should be a question which is decided politically as opposed to judicially. I don't know what you think.
I think that given the rulings can be given on the interpretation of this legislation in so many different directions at once by so many different people, that the legislation itself is too unclear. I think that this is a very, as far as I can see, a very clear argument to say that this legislation needs updating. I mean, the fact that making the Equality Act clear, that's been the gender critical slogan this whole time, has been subject to so much debate already. Well, it just shows you the original legislation wasn't explicit enough in how it defined man or woman or biological sex or any of these categories. It's clear to me that the ability for this to play court tennis, as I mentioned, to go up and down between different rulings at different times from different people, shows you that the law itself wasn't clear. So what better impetus to be able to have to update it, to make it clearer? And obviously I would want it to be more explicitly trans inclusive, especially given that under the Gender Recognition Act, people with GRCs are supposed to be treated as legally male or female, depending on where they've transitioned to, not where they've transitioned from. Right? It's about what your acquired gender rather than your sex assigned at birth under the Gender Recognition Act. So, such is the level of ambiguity, I would want the government to at least make a firm ruling either way. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to get a level to which people don't understand the reality because everything is so ambiguous, At least if they update the legislation to make it trans antagonistic, then I can get out of the country and move somewhere else, right? And know where I stand. Whereas at the moment, no one knows where they stand, even after we've had a Supreme Court ruling. And I think that is the worst of both worlds, to be honest, is it will still allow for more lawfare. It will still allow for more kind of aggressive policing of gendered spaces, whilst there is still at least some ability for there to be a continued legal battle for trans people to understand where they are as well in terms of this. Like, it's difficult.
And on that saying, if they made a law that was trans antagonistic, you'd know to leave the country. Now, I don't know how sort of literal you're being, but sort of to expand on that, what could the government do that would make you think, fuck it, okay, this is disastrous. There's no nuance we can do here. There's no ambiguity. This is just making it impossible to be trans in Britain.
I mean, not having access to those spaces would be the thing that would be the kind of the straw that would break the camel's back, as far as I'm concerned. Like, the people who are the biggest danger to trans women are cisgender men, right? Forcing trans women into those spaces is already incredibly dangerous, right? It's dangerous to exist as a trans person already. Or any woman, a trans woman or a cisgender woman, it's very dangerous to be around cisgender men, right? And so that's the kind of thing where I wouldn't be able to exist in society. That would make it impossible for me to be able to be using of public spaces in a way that would be safe. It would also open up far more or even more lack of safety for gender non-conforming people. If people know already that trans people aren't supposed to be in these spaces, gender non-conforming cis women will also be a target of this. It's happened in America already, where you've had these kind of bathroom bills, where people have said things like, you look like a man, you don't be in it. And they will invite in cisgender men into these spaces to remove them when they are just masculine presenting or butch cisgender women. This has happened in places like Florida already. I have friends who are leaving the United States already in the wake of these kind of bathroom bills, and of course the antagonistic nature of the current government in America. They're already fleeing the United States based upon having lack of provision for single-sex spaces. That would be the thing that would make it difficult for me to be able to exist, But then, things like, even in this judgment, there are some things that are also very unnerving and the kind of the part of that slippery slope, insofar as the fact that trans women can be discriminated against as women, but only if they're not perceived as them, for example, means that trans women don't get equal pay access in comparison to cisgender men, as far as this is concerned. They would be treated as cisgender men. So even if they're paid less, they wouldn't be able to have access to equal pay law. The people who would have access to equal pay law would be trans men with cisgender men, because they would be the ones who would be perceived as women by the Equality Act and therefore have access to be able to have their pay grade be upgraded to that, the same as gender men, and be able to take that to court, which is ironic given that the people who have the most amount of pay bias in terms of cisgender, transgender, and their gender as well, So these cisgender men and cisgender women get paid more than trans men and transgender women, but trans women are literally the least paid statistically out of all of these four groups when you put them together. So people being removed from things like equal pay legislation make it then difficult for you to be able to exist as well, because you require money to be able to do that, of course. So I think that single-sex spaces really are the thing that's important. Like, how can you exist in society if you can't go to a public toilet? That is very, very difficult for me personally.
The Board of Deputies of British Jews is the largest organisation representing Jewish people in Britain. Of course, not every British Jew takes themselves to be represented by the group, which has always taken a pretty hardline stance in its support for Israel. But that now may be changing. 36 members of the board, that's about 10% of the deputies, have now signed an open letter published in the Financial Times condemning Israel's assault on Gaza. In their letter, the deputies explain they can no longer remain silent over the attack because, quote, silence is seen as support for policies and actions that run contrary to our Jewish values. And one of the signatories is Philip Goldenberg, who explained his position to the BBC.
It is awful and is betrayal of Jewish ethical values. Look, this war could have come to an end and the hostages could have been released. Netanyahu deliberately revived it so as to lure back into his government some bigoted extreme racists to keep his majority so he doesn't lose office. It's as simple and crude as that.
Right. I mean, the people that he lured back, as you say, into his government represent a considerable, albeit a minority, but a considerable body of opinion in Israel.
Yes, it's a democratic society. Different people have different views.
Was there a tipping point for you?
I think the tipping point was Netanyahu's decision deliberately to restart the war for his own political reasons. And I think that was so outrageous.
And the effect of what is going on in Israel, what effect is it having on Jews that you know in the UK?
Look, there is a significant problem of anti-Semitism, as indeed there is a significant problem of Islamophobia. And most people don't actually distinguish between Israelis and Jews. So Muslims get smeared with the collective guilt for 9/11 or what Hamas did on the 7th of October. British Jews get smeared with the collective guilt for the actions of the Israeli government.
Helena, how significant do you think this letter is?
I think it's incredibly important, because the biggest argument that you get from the pro-Israel argument is that there is something innately connecting Zionism and Jewishness, which of course there isn't. Or indeed, this idea that if you have taking a hardline stance against the actions of the Israeli government, then there must be something anti-Semitic there, even if it's entirely on the grounds of just what's happening in the offensive in Gaza, not in terms of Zionism versus anti-Zionism. A lot of arguments you hear, well, you only take this position with Israel and nobody else, therefore it's anti-Semitic, right? When I think that it's understandable for people like what you just heard there, that we see the Board of Deputies as being there to represent the interests of the British Jewish community at large, which is politically and ideologically diverse and is not entirely unified. And so seeing this explicitly being made as a group that does represent them, saying, well, no, there is internal conflict on this issue. You can't paint an entire ethno-religious group that's a minority in a country as entirely having their position tied to the actions of a foreign government that makes its own case to being an ethno-state of that ethno-religious group. Therefore, it would undermine these people in this country if they can have their own existence tied to foreign policy decisions elsewhere. And it's frustrating. I've had other Jewish people have been very critical of the Board of Deputies acting on the interest of what is good for Israel and not of the British Jewish community. And I'm assuming people like the guy you just heard there find that very aggravating too. Like, no, we absolutely take opposition to what's happening in Gaza. We absolutely take opposition to it. And that is central to Jewish values. A lot of Bundists would agree, you know. Michael Brooks was asked about this. The late great Michael Brooks was asked about this, and he said, "Well, what Israel does is contrary to everything that I was taught to believe as a Jewish person. My Jewish values absolutely reject the actions of the Israeli government." And so, having this delineation being explicit, because the highest kind of institution that represents the Jewish community in Britain at large, say, no, we need to separate what is good for us as a group of people, as an ethno-religious group, away from what's good from what's happening within the state of Israel. Making these explicit and separate is super important for having I hate to say this phrase, but a grown-up and adult discussion about what happens in Israel without people trying to condemn you for having some ulterior motive for why you oppose things like war crimes or violations of international law, which should be something you should be able to have a conversation around without people trying to undermine your motivations as being based upon what happens with regards to the ethnic makeup of the state that you're criticizing. And so having it explicitly being made that case by somebody who's there ostensibly and correctly as a representation as a part of the representation of the Jewish community at large shows that you can't pigeonhole this into being about the ethno-religious group in question. It's about the state, it's about the ideology, it's about what's happening in practice. And dividing those two is incredibly important for the way in which we approach the entire discussion of Israel at large. One last point on top of this as well is that I think what's scary, it should be scary for a lot of Jewish people in this country, is that this idea that Israel and the international Jewish community are one and the same, that makes anti-Semitism worse. It does make anti-Semitism worse, right? Actual anti-Semites can use this not just as a justification, but as cover. Like there are lots of genuine anti-Semites who say, I'm just an anti-Zionist. Don't try and lump me in with the anti-Semites when what they're saying is anti-Semitic. So without that delineation, it gives these people plausible deniability for their anti-Semitism, right? Which gets covered up from the other side, calling everybody's anti-Zionist anti-Semitic. Whereas if we can have a discussion where we can delineate these things away from each other, then that makes everybody much more aware of where the real anti-Semitism lies, rather than trying to conflate the two things together between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And that's important to have as well. Just the one, because the Jewish community at large shouldn't be connected to Israel because of all the things that they're doing. That genocide isn't a Jewish value. Like, I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, I mean, we've commented a lot actually throughout this genocidal war, how sort of dangerous it is for the Board of Deputies to often come out, sort of the official Board of Deputies, and sort of say, basically be defending Israel, essentially, and sort of smearing critics of Israel. So to have these members of the Board of Deputies sort of saying, not in our name, does seem quite significant. Donald Trump's brinkmanship with China has already dramatically backfired. After realizing the damage it would do to the United States economy, Trump has already exempted smartphones and other electronics from his 145% tariffs. What's more, the US has belatedly realized the damage China can cause if it halts exports of the materials and parts which are essential to US production. China has already halted the export of rare earths and magnets needed for the car and semiconductor industries, and China has now stopped exporting the jets Boeing needs to build its commercial airplanes. So how did Trump get his trade war so wrong? Well, on the one hand, the answer is simple. Donald Trump is a moron. But the Harvard-trained economist, Keyu Jin, thinks there's something deeper going on. Namely, not just Trump, but rather the entire Western political establishment just doesn't understand what's happening in Beijing and how strong the Chinese economy has become. Keyu Jin is currently Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, and she's the author of the new China playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. Keyu Jin is also a Chinese national, and she spoke to me from Beijing, and I began by asking whether she thinks China has already won Trump's trade war.
No one really wins from a trade war, and China is actually very not interested in engaging in any kind of trade war, but really is pushed into the stance of resistance, even fighting until the end, as the leaders say. It's very interesting, the perspective from inside China, where I am right now, where there's an almost consensus, whether it's the government or the people, then this is the right strategy to deal with Trump. Stay strong, hit the U.S. where it hurts until you can bring them back to rational dialogue. So there has been almost no debate about the fact that China has done these retaliatory tariffs and has held their position.
Yeah, and I wanted to know actually about attitudes in China to the trade war. It's been well publicized in the West how Canada responded to Trump's trade war. There was a rally around the flag, economic nationalism. Have we seen a similar thing going on in China?
Well, Trump really brought that onto China during his first presidency, really mobilized the whole nation, whether it's to undertake these technological leaps and advancements, or it's to give unity and more power to the central leadership, which is, I'm not sure this is what Washington, D.C. really wants. It has led the government to refocus on growth. And this time around, it is giving Beijing compelling force to double down on technological innovations, embrace new partners, including draw closer ties to the UK and Europe, to stimulate aggressively, to subsidize strategically, and to pivot tactically. It's given them this renewed confidence and unity around a single goal, which was kind of absent for a while. And I presume this is also true not only for Canada, but for also many other countries.
Yeah, and could we talk about the last 2 weeks in the context of the last 8 years when it comes to tariffs? So obviously this round of the trade war has been the most dramatic, the most chaotic. But in Trump's first term, he also introduced tariffs on China, which were then extended and to some degree sort of strengthened under Joe Biden. So yeah, could you talk about the trade war in a longer term perspective?
Actually, China has been preparing for this for a long time. For the last 8 years, at the very least, they are increasingly reducing their exposure to the U.S., really trying not to be at the mercy of the U.S., whether it comes to technology or the dollar or many other kind of dependencies. If you look at Trump 1.0 and what that has done to the Chinese economy, to the people, to the Chinese companies, well, first of all, it has set off a complete globalization frenzy among the Chinese companies. They have searched for new markets, opened new factories elsewhere, very, very resilient in adapting to new circumstances. Of course, there was short-term pain, but the Chinese people don't just lie flat, to use the the phrase that is popular these days, which means to give up. They find new ways. And so that has started this complete trend. And I think the most significant is the growing tech autonomy. To be quite frank, a few years ago, China was in an existential crisis. They were really fearing being cut off from the critical components technology chain by the US, but it is no longer this position. You can argue that China is weak economically compared to a few years ago, but it is certainly technologically stronger. And more importantly, not only has it been able to fill a lot of the critical gaps in the tech supply chain over the last few years, thanks to US export controls, including Biden's export controls, but also the likes of pivotal economies like Japan and Korea have joined China's tech supply chain. Even if they're not fully committed, they are definitely hedging. So this time around, because of these highly aggressive, nonsensical aggressive actions taken by President Trump's administration, it has really pushed other countries, and including Europe, dare I say, to work closely with China, again, hedging bets in light of the increasing U.S. unreliability.
And one big difference to me when it comes to sort of comparing the past 8 years to the past 2 weeks seems to be just how chaotic, how incompetent Trump has seemed over the past 2 weeks. You could maybe sort of pass a logic in his first term and under Joe Biden to what they were doing. Now, the rationale just seems unclear. And I want to know from you, I suppose, how much has the last 2 weeks, events since Liberation Day, as it was called, how much has that damaged the prestige of America in China?
Well, certainly the U.S. has damaged its reputation from the Trump 1.0 because, at least from the Chinese perspective, seems that all the actions are meant to suppress China, to prevent China from rising. And that is something that the Chinese people find unfair and unjust and very difficult to accept. This time around, it's almost been more of a joke. In some ways, the tariff rates have exceeded expectations, but the way he's been going about this, and also with the rest of the world, it just seems so completely ludicrous to the Chinese that it's not so much hatred and an emotional response that it has elicited, but just kind of curious what's going on. And doesn't he understand that this is damaging the U.S. reputation, not more so in China, but also around the world, where U.S. credibility, the power of U.S. dollar, the power and the dominance of U.S. reputation over so many areas is completely in the midst of eroding or even crumbling. So I think that for the Chinese, it's pretty clear to them that a big bifurcation is happening.
And let's talk about some economic challenges that China does face, and I suppose ways they could respond to this trade war. And in particular here, lots of people have been talking about the challenge of increasing consumption. So China has had structurally very low consumption rates for a long time. And you've got a savings rate of about 44%, which means people are saving an enormous amount of their incomes. In the UK, for example, I think it's only 11%, the savings rate. So how can China increase consumption among Chinese people, and why have they struggled to do that so far?
Well, the Trump shock certainly has refocused the country back to domestic consumption. There is really no way out of this. It's not just about tension with the U.S., but also growing tension with the rest of the world, where weak consumption just simply means more exports of not only cheap apparel and textiles and toys this time around, but highly advanced components and technologies like EV batteries and so forth. And that creates a new kind of potential challenge for the rest of the world. And this is really only resolved by either China raising prices, that could be done by an exchange rate appreciation, but more importantly, by the domestic demand, which will, I believe, solve a lot of the issues at hand. Now, one of the core issues, and I think that this is not very well understood from the rest of the world, is that there are still hundreds of millions of people who reside in the countryside and in lower income households who still lack proper social protection and access to things like health and education. And in the short term, consumption is potentially weaker than it should be because of the cyclical problems, the uncertainty in jobs, the uncertainty in whether wages will rise in the future, and the young generation's frustration. But more deeply at the core is there's this vast group of people who haven't really made it to real middle income levels yet. And so their appetite to consume is very high. And this is why the Chinese government has now firmly shifted from supply side stimulus back to demand side stimulus. I doubt that it's going to work in China as it does in the US or the UK, handing out checks and, telling people go spend your money. That doesn't really work in China. But there are other ways potentially to, let's say, force consumption by giving you vouchers and things like that. These are marginal things, but that can get the engine going. In the end, China's big problem is this vast and geographical disparity. Undereducated, underemployed people living in the rural areas with urban cosmopolitan elites, many of whom have actually reached 30,000 or even 35,000 per capita income. And so closing that gap is the essential answer to raising demand. I do want to add in one cheeky, although very true, way of raising consumption, and that's have more kids. You know how much one of those costs. Have more kids and look, you'll spend more money, but you'll feel safer when you're old because at least one of them will turn out to be supportive and be nice to you. So you can save less.
And is there also a story about China which sort of links the birth rate and low consumption rates, which is connected to the lack of a welfare state in China? So I suppose, surprisingly for Western audiences, you've got a party called the Communist Party, which seems to be somewhat averse to rolling out a generous welfare state. Now, what that means is that people feel like they have to save money for a rainy day because the government won't step in and support them if they do become unemployed. I think pensions are very low as well. So to resolve this problem, to increase consumption in China so that they're not so reliant on exports, does the CCP need to reconsider the idea of having a strong welfare state rolled out across China?
I think this goes beyond a Communist Party issue. It is largely a cultural issue, where in China, having a very large welfare state, whether it's the government's mind or even the people's mind, tends to not induce hard work, which is really the foundation of the Chinese ethos. And so I think it's not just by government design that they have made that choice. I think the uncertainty about the future is a very real but a very recent thing, because Chinese people saw their income, their wages grow year on year, and their lives improving substantially. And their generations, the generations below them, their children's welfare improving substantially. So they had nothing to complain about, and they were less worried. But that has changed as the economy has gone into the more of a stagnant or even a recessionary situation in the last few years, and they have become more anxious. I don't think that their belief of a large welfare state is the solution to the uncertainties in the economy, but I do believe that they do need to have broader social protections. So pension needs to be broadly covered. And just to give you an example, someone who's living in the countryside was only 5% of the average pension of someone who's living in the urban areas, amounting to around, let's say, 40 pounds or so per month, which is not really enough. And then China also has a hukou system, which prevents migration of people from one province to another. So people, migrant workers, and there are 180 million of them in China, have very little access to schools and healthcare, even while they're working in cities. It's these kind of issues, specific issues, rather than broadening, enhancing, or providing a bigger welfare state, that I think is more important.
That was Keyu Jin speaking to me earlier today, and that was just part of a much longer interview. Really, really interesting. We get onto the idea of whether this trade war could bleed into a military conflict over Taiwan. And I have to say, Keyu's answer was not particularly reassuring. So do check that out. Tomorrow morning, we'll be putting out the full interview then.
I feel super connected to love. so connected to love. I think this experience has shown me you never know how much love is inside of you, like how much love you have to give and how loved you are until the day you launch.
That was singer and now astronaut Katy Perry telling all of us who can't afford the tens of millions of dollars it costs to be blasted into space by Jeff Bezos that we'll never know love. That profundity came after Perry returned to Earth following her 11-minute trip to space, along with 5 other women, and they included Oprah bestie Gayle King and Blue Origin founder Jeff Bezos' fiancée, Lauren Sanchez. Also on board was civil rights activist Amanda Nguyen and rocket scientist Aisha Bowe. Explaining the importance of the mission, Perry, who also became the first woman in history to release the set list for her upcoming tour in zero gravity, told reporters this.
It's not about me. It's not about singing my songs. It's about a collective energy in there. It's about us. It's about making space for future women and taking up space and belonging. And it's about this wonderful world that we see right out there and appreciating it. This is all for the benefit of Earth.
A giant step for womankind, all for the benefit of Earth. Fantastic. I'm inspired. Not everyone is buying it, though. Model and actress Emily Ratajkowski had this take.
That space mission this morning, that's end time shit. Like, this is beyond parody. Saying that you care about Mother Earth and it's about Mother Earth and you're going up in a spaceship that is built and paid for by a company that's single-handedly destroying the planet. Look at the state of the world and think about how many resources went into putting these women into space. For what? For what was the marketing there? And then to try to make it like, I'm disgusted, literally, I'm disgusted.
She had a few more videos that she posted up, which I thought were quite interesting. I mean, the point she was making is essentially that it's not feminist to go up in space at the whim of Jeff Bezos, right? Because none of them, I don't think, they hadn't, earned their place there. They were handpicked by Jeff. Well, I think they were handpicked by Jeff Bezos' fiance, but I don't think Jeff Bezos' fiance has, much to say for herself beyond being Jeff Bezos' fiance. It was very much a sort of Jeff Bezos vanity project to put these women in space. The rocket does look bizarrely and curiously, until Stephen was telling me this because I hadn't seen the clip. I was like, well, don't all rockets look a bit like a penis? But this rocket really looks like a penis. And the women went up into space sort of in the head of the penis. Anyway, Helena, what did you make of this? Were you inspired by this trip? What did you think of the response? I mean, a critique could be that these are sort of very rich women arguing with each other, but still we can find one of them more persuasive than the other.
Well, I think Ratajkowski's point about the climate impact of such a thing, they're very on point. I do agree with her. Obviously, there is a class analysis to this as well. But if we start with the climate analysis, it reminds me of a very funny tweet by Spice8Rack, who's a YouTuber leftist, saying that, isn't it terrible how I have to spend all of my time scraping out residual chicken korma out of Tupperware to try and save the planet with recycling, whilst Jeff Bezos can blow up millions and millions of dollars of rocket fuel to eat floaty skittles for 10 minutes. And that doesn't seem particularly fair. And I think that's why there is a lot of backlash against climate politics at the moment, because it seems to be that the only people who are restricted in terms of how we deal with the climate crisis are the poor. It's only the poor that have to deal with this stuff, right? The rich can get away with it. They can blow up as much rocket fuel as they want. There's no restrictions on what they do in terms of how they affect the planet. Mega corporations can incinerate fossil fuels all they like whilst the planet burns. And normal people, they're the ones who have to bear the brunt and have to make cutbacks and sacrifices, have to sort the rubbish into the 7 bins, as Rishi Sunak would say, to deal with the climate crisis. And whilst people should be doing that, it shouldn't have an exception being made for the people who already have everything. Like, Jeff, you're one of the richest men in the world. You don't need to get special dispensation to destroy the planet on top of it, and on top of what Amazon already does to help destroy the planet. So the climate argument of that, regardless of the class politics, is important. You're not saving the Earth by, again, not even doing anything that's necessarily space exploration. There no barriers are being broken here. This is commercial space flight. This is a stunt. No one's breaking kind of scientific boundaries is what's being done here. As someone who studied astrophysics and spent their entire childhood wanting to be a cosmonaut, the idea that it should now be privatized, essentially. It's a privatized service that the rich get to do it whilst at the expense of everybody else. It really just kind of throw that into sharp relief for me, that it used to be this kind of pinnacle of human endeavor, and now it's just a plaything for the oligarchs. And there are probably plenty of women who had spent so much time working on all of the different space projects globally since the start of the space race in the 50s. And in fact, of course, there were many of the women who programmed the initial kind of Apollo program, that they were black women, and they were only kind of after quite a while given the kind of plaudits that they should have been given for the work they did on the Apollo program, right? There are probably plenty of female scientists who should have been given the opportunity to go up on Blue Origin, at the very least to be able to see the Earth from space. And instead we're giving it to influencers and people married to rich people. I'm sorry, but this is the worst kind of girl boss feminism. Like, this isn't getting anywhere. This isn't good politics. And when it comes to like the class issue, as I said, like, we're in a cost of living crisis globally. Globally, there is a cost of living crisis. People can't afford to make ends meet, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the United Kingdom, or wherever it is. People are finding it very, very difficult. And the fact that we are literally getting this kind of gated community style explosion of wealth and it demonstrates such a kind of vain demonstration of wealth, at the same time as people are genuinely finding it difficult to be able to clothe their children, really just kind of show you just how unequal society is at the moment, and how much the rich just don't give a shit. They don't care, they don't understand, and in fact they kind of glorify and enjoy this kind of vulgar demonstration of their own wealth at the expense of everybody else. Because then again, that's where all the money came from. Jeff Bezos admitted this on the very first Blue Origin flight. Thank you for all the Amazon workers and consumers. You were the ones that paid for this. Damn right. Give us our surplus value back, you motherfucker.
I think, do we have footage of the penis-shaped rocket going up? Potentially, I think we're going to get, because as I say, when I was told it looked like a penis, I was like, well, that's just what rockets look like. But if we can get it up, maybe we can't. If not, people can Google it themselves. Don't worry. Oh, we can't.
It definitely does. 100%.
Just believe us when we say that it does. You can check it out for yourself. If you haven't seen it before, you will be shocked. Let's wrap up there. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me, as always, and good to meet you for the first time too.
Yeah, fabulous. And I'll see you again in the corridor in about 2 minutes' time. Thank you for watching another Novara Live. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. as ever. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.